Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for dialing in and welcome to today's ProcureCon webinar, The Hidden Risk in Your Supply Chain. It's a case study with Southern Company. We've got some really great speakers lined up for today. Really happy to present Joel Van Kampen and Brett Armstrong from the Browse team and Dan Meeks from Southern Company. I'm gonna jump right in to do some introductions. So Joel is the Director of Professional Services at Browse. So he's been there for about 11 years, and during his time with the company, he has led the planning and implementation of contractor pre-qualification programs for clients across multiple industries. His responsibilities include client relationships, implementation management, training and mentoring management teams, as well as new product strategy. So really great to have him on board today. Brett Armstrong is the Vice President at Browse, and he's been with the company for over 10 years, and he's got experience in managing teams that have supported the world's leading organizations during the implementation and ongoing management of supply chain qualification programs. And lastly, we have Dan Meeks, the Sourcing Agent Supply Chain Management at Southern Company. He's had 38 years in telecommunications with line and staff roles in engineering, revenue requirements, industry relations, and finance. He's also been a sourcing agent with Southern Company since about 2007, performing contractor pre-qualification, bid process, labor, and material contracts. So really excited to have these three guys on board today. And just a little bit of housekeeping, I want to let the audience know that we're going to try to save about 10 to 15 minutes or so at the end of today's webinar for a Q&A session. So please refer to the box in your control panel labeled questions and submit any questions that you have for our panelists throughout the duration. So without further ado, enough talking from me, let me pass this over to Brett.
All right, great. Thanks, Elise. I appreciate those introductions. Dan and Joel, really appreciate you both taking the time today to meet and to maybe share some of your experiences that the two of you have had. In preparation for today's webinar, I went back and, if I'm not mistaken, Browse and Southern Company have been working together for a little over 8 years. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
All right, great. So Dan, maybe before we jump into the presentation, I would just ask if you take a minute and just share a little bit more about Southern Company, maybe provide an overview of the organization and kind of the background leading up to engaging Browse. Dan, are you there?
Yes, sorry. Southern Company is a parent company for several entities, 4 of them being traditional power utilities: Georgia Power, Alabama Power, Mississippi Power, and Gulf Power. And through those 4 companies, they cover a total footprint of about 120,000 square miles with 44 megawatts of generating capacity. Also, there's Southern Nuclear, which has a number of nuclear sites, as the name would imply. That is a separate company. And there's also a telecom company and also a wireless Southern Link services. Another entity that we have, which is a non-regulated entity, is Southern Power, which may have locations throughout the United States. They wholesale, generating wholesale power to other companies, and also are highly involved in wind and solar activities.
That's great. As far as no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to comment. Given the size of the organization, contractor management must be a huge initiative.
It is for the area that I am in. Is the generation entity for Southern, and we're a service company supplying procurement and contract services to all of those other entities. We're not uniform. We're a large company. We're not uniform throughout the company the way we do this. Some divisions, like our transmission and distribution divisions, are sort of converting to Browse, but within the generation entity, that is our generating plants, we are totally reliant on Browse for our contractor pre-qualification process. One other thing I probably should have mentioned as far as size our annual revenues are about 19 billion, and we have about 26,000 employees. So,
wow, yeah, it's certainly a large initiative when you start to consider some of the work that has been done over the last 8 years. You know, maybe I would just ask the question: prior to engaging Browse, how were you managing contractors at that time?
Well, in the introduction, it was mentioned that I spent quite a long time in telecommunications, and when that ended, I was not ready to go to full retirement or retirement at all. So I happened to take a job that really no one else wanted to do as really a temporary employee for Southern Company, which turned into a permanent job. But that job was pre-qualification. And as I said, none of the other sourcing agents really wanted to do that. And it involved contacting the potential bidders, contractors, usually by email. And then we were responsible in supply chain for securing their compliance and safety and financial information, and then distributing that to like safety groups and other groups within the company for getting decisions, you know, as far as approving them for our bid list and so forth. So it was a constant stream of emails, and then there was no consistency to speak of. I might be doing it, someone else might have a need, not realize I was doing it. So, you know, you would contact a company and they would say, oh, well, yesterday Jim Smith called and asked the same thing. So that's kind of the way it was, and it was a nightmare to kind of organize and keep track of, and I probably did that for about a year before we started the Browse process.
Wow. So Dan, you mentioned that nobody else in sourcing wanted to do that job, and I can make some assumptions as to why, but you know, I'm curious from your perspective, why is that a role that nobody else was interested in assuming?
Well, I think, you know, most of the people that were doing it or having to do it by default probably regarded that as a little bit, well, as the manager I came to work for, when he offered it to me, he said it's kind of grunt work. And I mean, a lot of these people that do the contracts for us are attorneys or CPAs or qualified sourcing agents. So, you know, they'd rather be conducting the bid process and negotiating contracts than going out and, you know, collecting a bunch of information about a company and trying to get others within Southern Company to approve that company.
So Dan, is it fair to say that it was viewed as grunt work, as you said, due to a lack of tools? Was it just the constant need to reach out to collect the documentation? What specifically was it that led to that?
Well, I think the volume, the volume of emails and trying to organize it, and plus many times, people were coming to you saying, I need this today or tomorrow, and you didn't have adequate time really to collect all the information. You would approach the contractor and they would say, well, I just gave that to you last month. Don't you still have it? Or I work for another entity within Southern Company and they didn't ask all of this. So it was just kind of a thankless job. And, depending on who was approving the bid list, there might be different parameters that were being considered. It wasn't consistent. So, it was just a task that was not very, very attractive, really.
Okay, now that's very helpful to understand that background. And Joel, I guess I would ask you, I don't know how many implementations that you've been a part of over the course of the last 11 years for Browse, it's probably in the hundreds, but I'm just curious, from your perspective, was this challenge that Southern Company was facing, was it any different than what you see in working with other organizations, or is that pretty common?
It's a pretty common practice, Brett. I know that without a formal tool in place to manage this volume, to manage this insight into the supply chain can be very challenging. So this is a common concern we hear from the clients that we implement, and the solution that we put in front of them allows them better insight, better viewability, and a lot easier way to go about doing this. So this is a common concern.
And Joel, in your experience, is it typical that organizations are collecting this information via email? Is it spreadsheets and filing cabinets? What kind of states do you typically see a qualification process in when you're first engaged?
When we start up, it's typically via email, like Dan said. I mean, there's links in off the client sites that will capture some of this demographic information, some of this high-level company information, and it's all generating emails to specific inboxes based on the point of origin, based on the type of work, based on who they want to do work for within the client's organization. So we see this typically all being managed through email.
Okay, great. And Dan, I guess understanding a little bit of the background, some of the challenges that you're facing, what was the ultimate goal of putting a formal pre-qualification program in place for the contractors and suppliers? Was there a single goal or maybe multiple goals?
Well, there were multiple goals, and I cannot take credit for starting that process. Unbeknownst to me, it had maybe had started when I assumed this manual role in doing this. But one objective was to provide a consistent database, of contractors, all displaying the same information, evaluated the same way, and free up those people that were doing this so that they could do other things. And there were also other things besides the qualification data that we stored in Browse, for example, and this is kind of on a need-to-know basis, but our human resources has the results of background investigations and DNA testing and so forth also stored in Browse. So it was just to develop kind of a single source that we could go to for contractor-related information when we were needing to put a bid list together.
Okay, fantastic. And I would imagine a secondary benefit, besides what you've already talked about, is I would have to imagine from a contractor or supplier's perspective, using the example that you gave before where they were being asked to resubmit data because there were multiple parties involved, would you say that there was benefit to the contractors and suppliers by having that single source of qualification, pre-qualification?
Yes, because they were not asked for, the same information over and over again. And then also some of the information we were collecting, for example, like your EMR ratings, those are based on the policy period of the contractor's insurance. So, those are constantly being updated with additional information, and instead of us maybe looking at the files we had stored on our hard drive to see if we had current EMRs or current OSHA data, Browse keeps that information updated for us.
Okay, fantastic. Now, one question that comes up oftentimes when we're engaged by an organization is the questions asked, who should be involved in the creation or implementation of a contractor supply chain pre-qualification program? Is it solely a procurement focus? I'm just curious from Southern Company's perspective, who was involved and maybe who's involved today in that process?
It's a joint activity. Of course, I am a supply chain, a procurement employee, and we're involved from the standpoint as we enter the bid process. We are the sole source to talk to those potential bidders and collect information, and even until the award of work. Any questions, discussions, so forth about the work under consideration would go through us. So that kind of put us in position to also pre-qualify the contractors. We also have a group that is over in our construction and engineering side that works very closely with us, that does a lot of the bid list development now, and they have really jumped in to using Browse. And so probably the fact that we have this information so readily available has probably caused that group to be, more I guess, accept the responsibility more of helping us on put the bid list together, so forth.
Okay, great. So it definitely sounds like it's become a collaborative process. And, Joel, I know you and I have talked about this oftentimes, but 10 years ago, about the same time when we both started with Browse, really much of this focus was in safety, where we were working very closely with safety departments early on. Have you seen a change, or have you observed maybe a evolution over the last 10 years in terms of who's involved in these types of programs?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that's due to the capabilities of the system. So safety was the driver, back in the day, because of, that was kind of the core competency of the tool, looking at safety metrics, safety manual, safety stats, EMR, like Dan had mentioned. And then the need becomes greater from a risk perspective, bringing in your legal team, looking at insurance, HR, looking at employee level information. So over time, it has evolved into much larger stakeholder groups and much more diversified stakeholder groups. So everybody wants, their piece of the action in the system. And it becomes a more single source tool, like Dan had mentioned in his comment. So yes, it is growing into larger groups.
One thing I might mention from the safety involvement in our process, one thing we do is for the safety managers to approve, to review and approve the safety manuals. And before we went to Browse, well, sometimes those manuals for a large company are massive. And we had safety managers located in a number of different cities that would have to review those manuals. So before Browse, I implemented a SharePoint site, that contractors could upload those manuals to me because they were too large to email. And so that was another logistical thing, that with the manuals being stored in Browse now, and the safety manual can just log onto the system, look at the manual and review it, that was a big improvement for us.
It's fantastic. Maybe along those lines, and Joel, maybe I'll pose this question to you. Let's talk a little bit more about the business requirements of Southern Company with contractors that they work with. We know that Browse has worked to address the 1926 OSHA standard and the NERC SIP regulatory standard, but how else do you see Browse having been able to assist Southern Company with other standards specific to the utility industry? Can you think of any examples?
So from a safety perspective, that was the big driver when we started the program in 2008, looking at safety manuals, looking at beginning the gathering of quality manuals, legal information on the companies that are doing work for. So from a pre-qualification perspective, you want to look at higher overarching information of a company. And then as Southern Company would determine the contractors they were actually going to engage in business with, then we put more of a fine point on it. We were looking at trending data around safety stats, looking at recordable rates, lost workday rates, and the drive of those rates coming down, looking at EMR, and then the safety manual and the audit protocol by which we evaluate the safety manuals. Very relevant to the type of work that they're doing for Southern Company. And then it gives Southern Company peace of mind that their contractors are trained and able and ready to do the type of work that they've indicated through the pre-qualification process that they're going to do for Southern Company. So it starts with at the big end of the funnel, and as they engage them in work, we really put a fine point on it and get Dan and has seen some really good data around the safety and legal side of the business.
Okay, so let's maybe talk a little bit more about that. You mentioned safety is really just one component of that. What other types of data points is Southern Company looking at and using the browse system to collect and validate? And I'll leave that to either one of you who might want to touch on that.
I don't mind. Go ahead, Joel.
Well, I was just going to say, once we get into safety data in place, Brett, then we do an overlay when they engage the suppliers into doing work for a specific operating company or a specific type of work. Then we'll do an overlay of the insurance management on some of these suppliers as well. So it's just a graduation of requirements and different things that we're doing for these suppliers as it pertains to where they're at in the process with Southern Company, from a pre-qualification to an engagement process. Dan?
Well, specifically, to talk a little bit about the qualification criteria that we use, we have goals for the EMR and then the OSHA total recordable incident rate. We also have a set of compliance questions that may lead to future review, depending on what the contractor's response to that is, financial information, and OSHA violations. Then I mentioned the safety manuals, also the quality manuals. We review and approve or identify shortcomings that must be met for approval of those manuals. We also have requirements for diverse contractors, so that is something else that Browse stores for us. We collect information, as to whether the company is a small business, female-owned, minority, so forth. So that helps us with that objective also.
Okay, fantastic. And Joel, some of the other products that I know that we, talk to organizations about would include experience, financial stability indicators, online training capabilities, time and attendance tracking. And I think with all of these potential areas of pre-qualification, it really opens up the ability to configure a system specific to an organization's need. I don't know of any case, even within a given industry, where we go in and say, here's the requirements for this industry. We need everybody to fit into that box. Can you talk a little bit about that process, how you work with the clients to configure a system specific to their needs?
Yeah, Brett. We spend a significant amount of time at the onset of the program with the stakeholders within the client organization to determine what it is that they want to start with. We've got benchmarking information, best practice information that we'll take to them. We certainly don't want to supplant their existing program, but if there isn't one in place, we're going to have some good data and some good information with us to kind of consult them through the onboarding and the upstart of the program. We obviously want to account for the things that are important to the client from a pre-qualification and a qualification process, while not putting such a stringent program in place that nobody can pass. So we've over time, we've been able to hit that sweet spot where we know this is going to get you what you want from the jump, get a quick win, get a good, solid, program under your belt. And then we have a year 2, year 3, year 4 roadmap that we recommend with our clients to add in additional functionality so that we're not overwhelming their contractors, but we're giving them, giving the client what they want from the onset of the program to give them some sense of comfort where their contractors are at.
And Dan, I guess I would ask you the question, was that important to you and your organization when selecting a provider, the configurable nature of the system?
Yes, it was. Of course, until we went operational and had some experience, we did not probably totally realize what could be done, but we knew enough that we thought, you know, it was a good decision to move forward with it. I will say that Browse has worked with us in making changes to the information we want to see, refining that and so forth, to pull that basic stored information into you know, a Southern Company specific template for us to use. So you know, it was a little hit and miss to get going, but you know, like Joel mentioned, we are using Browse for additional things now, like storing insurance certificates and helping us keep those up to date for major contracts that, you know, have a duration of over a year. So Browse has also worked with us to build an interface to feed our purchase order and accounts payable systems. I think we're handling over 60,000 vendors through that. So, wow. You know, we have grown since the initial implementation to meet some needs, and have been satisfied that, you know, Browse has been very responsive to those efforts.
So Dan, let's talk maybe a little bit about the suppliers and contractors that you're working with. Can you talk a little bit about how you're managing both your work awarded suppliers and also that population of potential new suppliers in selecting them? Can you give a sense of the workflow, maybe just a little bit the way that you've got things structured there?
Okay, I will kind of answer that in both aspects. As far as the suppliers that are already in Browse, there is you know, a lot of searches you can do in Browse, and one thing that I tried to emphasize to suppliers as they put information in Browse, give us as much information as possible. And one area I really like to emphasize, there is a products and services area, which Browse has a long list of functions that you can select as far as, you know, what is offered by your company. In the early days, I've seen something selected like power plant construction. Well, it's not very often that I'm going to go in and search for someone that does power plant construction. But if you go into more detail and populate such things as concrete foundations, steel tanks, welding, so forth and so on, and we go search for those keywords, we can develop a list of contractors to start to look, you know, and consider for bid list. So, you know, do we have every contractor that we use go into Browse? No, and the exception to that would be maybe some specialized contractors that maybe we've used once every 5 years, something like that. We would not ask them. We would still pre-qualify those types on a manual basis. We don't think it's fair to ask them to enter the system. If they want to do it, certainly that's fine. But our intent is to have, you know, our ongoing contractors that we partner with year after year within the system, so that all of their information is readily available for potential opportunities. As far as new contractors, if someone approaches me or someone else in the organization, what I like to do first is just send an email and say, hey, we use Browse. Here's our criteria. It's a paid membership. Browse also serves other clients besides Southern Company. And, you know, this is not a guarantee of work. If you go through the process, I would suggest that you come in and talk with some key individuals about opportunities, and, you know, your placement on a bid list would be based on our needs, your qualifications, so forth and so on. So I want them to know up front that just joining Browse is you know, we think it's a good thing, but it's not a guarantee of work. So if they tell me to, you know, okay, we're interested, go ahead and do it, on the home page for the system, there's a request new supplier link, and I can go to that, enter basic information about the company, and then a browse representative will take it from there and have the information entered into browse. Another way that I might get new companies in is the browse has a one-touch feature that I can go to and look and see companies that are in there with other clients. So that's something else that I would do for that company. I would look to see if they were already in there, and if that's the case, I would say, hey, you're in there with so-and-so company. If you desire browse, we'll send you a letter of consent to open your data up to Southern Company. If they say yes, then that's the way we go, and that's a pretty quick process.
Yeah, and Dan, that's one of the things we have potential clients ask us about all the time. What are some of the benefits to the contractors and suppliers that join your system? And I think that's huge to be able to expand their marketing capabilities to organizations who are also looking for safe and qualified and socially responsible contractors. It's a great way for them to market their own business. Maybe just one other question. I want to get to some metrics that you're looking at, but one last question. When you think about a supply chain, there's got to be varying levels of risk within that supply chain. At one end of the spectrum, you may have a locksmith. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got somebody who's working at heights, confined spaces. How do you account for those varying levels of risk? Do you expect everyone to meet the same standards, or how's that addressed within Southern Company's pre-qualification program?
Well, Joel may be able to answer that question better than me, but I will start out by saying this. I mentioned that we were not consistent throughout the company, that some other entities within our company may not use browse or may use it to a lesser extent than we do, and because some of those entities may not consider the OSHA rates as their criteria. They may only, for example, consider EMR. But if that's the case, sometimes I go in and look at some of those lower risk companies that are used in other entities, and they pull in different data. They might just pull in EMR as far as a safety criteria. So like I said, Joel probably has dealt with some of those and knows more about it than I do. But clearly, if you've got maybe a janitorial service that's in the system, that's much a lower risk than having a contractor that's doing crane services and heavy hauls. So.
Mm-hmm. Joel, can you maybe just touch on that for a minute? I guess I'd ask the question, one, you recommend organizations expect the same requirements for every contractor or suppliers that they work with? And if not, how does the browse solution or the solutions that you implement, how do those address those varying levels of risk?
Yeah, so typically we don't recommend that one size fits all for the client organization. We want to make sure that we're asking the right things of the right subsets of contractors. In the case of Southern Company, we've got several different risk levels appointed in their system. Each one of them looks maybe at the same thresholds around safety rates, because Southern Company has a pretty specific standard as it relates to total recordable rates, EMR rates, things of that nature. Where we start differentiating is twofold. Based on the type of work, so Dan's illustration was perfect in a janitorial versus maybe a confined space guy, is the items and the components we're evaluating and auditing in their safety manuals. So where we would be evaluating a safety manual, we'd be evaluating applicable to the type of work that they're doing for Southern Company and not blanket across the enterprise. And then the other point where the risk designation comes into play in the insurance classification. So when you're looking at labor brokers versus a professional services contractor, there's going to be differing levels of insurance or differing types of insurance. Again, this is going to strike the system such that it will hold accountable the contractors to a level of compliance scrutiny that is applicable to what they're doing for Southern Company.
All right, great. Thank you, Joel. Let's move on to the metrics that we've identified as being critical for success. Dan, I would ask the question, what types of metrics are you using to monitor the contractors and suppliers in your program?
Well, of course, the criteria that we have talked about is embedded in the browse logic. For example, if a company has an EMR that is above our threshold, then they're going to be shown as non-compliant. And there are 3 levels of ratings in browse, which are portrayed by different color icons in the system, and red being non-compliant, yellow being conditional, and green being compliant. So, and there's not only an overall rating for the company. As you expand the menu of various types of information stored for that company, you can see if maybe safety might be non-compliant, or financial might be conditional, and so forth. So I think overall that that compliance percentage, we get periodic information from Browse about you know, the level of compliance percentage-wise of our contractors. The program has means for you to go in and print a list of compliance status and other associated data for, you know, by contractor, and use that to tell you areas that maybe you need to address. Like periodically I might go in and print a list like that and identify those. Since in supply chain we're charged with the commercial aspects, I might go in and identify those that have some financial issue pending, and start to look at those and see you know, what we can do to move those maybe from a conditional status to a compliance status. So I think overall that compliance percentage is probably, you know, what drives us.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Dan. And just another question. You know, when you look back on where you're at today with those metrics that are available to you versus what you had previously, when, you know, you talked about you first started, you were tracking everything through email. Do you feel like you've got better control and understanding of your supply chain and where the risks really exist today?
Well, I definitely do, because I can go and create such summary reports to give me an overall view and let me know, you know, what areas of concern are and things we need to address. It was very difficult. You know, you could use spreadsheets and such as you tried to, on a manual basis, pre-qualify companies and collect all of that in a spreadsheet. But when you're dealing with hundreds of contractors and you're needing them now, sometimes that becomes a, you know, a secondary objective, and quite frankly, you don't do a very good job of keeping it up to date.
Okay, I think that's very helpful. I just want to remind everyone who's attending, if you have any questions, you can submit those to us. We're going to reserve the last 15 minutes or so to address those questions. I see that we've got a good number coming in. I do want to address one of those questions right now, as it's very specific for you, Dan. The question says, Mr. Meeks with Southern Company, you spoke earlier in the session that Browse has played a large part in the generation side of the business. Did Browse help consolidate and qualify on the line of operator qualifications?
I'm not quite sure what we mean by operator qualification.
Okay, I'm going to do my best to interpret here, and
okay.
Maybe the individual who submitted this, if I don't address this correctly, if you can provide some more information. I think the question would be maybe two-sided. One, you certainly already had a list of contractors, suppliers you were working with. So was Browse able to help consolidate that list of contractors and suppliers that you worked with? And then I think on the side of expectations for your contractors and suppliers, did Browse help you to narrow the focus of what you were asking for in terms of information?
Okay, I can address that. Yes, we actually initially cut about 355 contractors to Browse, and Joel came here with us, I think, for a 2-week period, and helped field questions from contractors, you know, that were trying to enter the system and become pre-qualified. We directed calls to him, so we cut those in. Now that number has grown to probably about 1,000. And that's even with the fact that from time to time we've gone in and kind of looked at, you know, some contractors that maybe decided that was not quite something they wanted to do, so they let their membership and agreement expire, and we've kind of moved those over into a holding pattern that we could go back and retrieve if we need to in the future. So yes, you know, once everyone realized that this is the way of doing business with us, it was one contact, consistent information. Everyone knew, you know, what was required, and they were hearing the same thing. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. You know, that really moves us into our next session in terms of addressing how to overcome challenges when you roll out this type of a program. You've talked about a few, and I think the last was a great example that some of this was creating a culture that contractors and suppliers needed to understand that this is the way that they did business now with Southern Company. Are there any other challenges that you experienced when you rolled out the program, and any advice that you would have to somebody who might face similar challenges?
I can really only remember on that initial rollout of one company that strongly objected, and I think it was probably more an individual within that company. We were concerned about that because information, even though maybe the same information is being requested of the contractor numerous times, nevertheless, they weren't paying anything, and now you're asking them to pay a membership in order to be considered for work. So we had some concern about that, but my response to that was, I think the fact that Browse serves other clients besides Southern Company, I think that is really a pretty good deal in terms of dollars that you're paying for the exposure and advertising that you're receiving. And I know that there are some other companies that do similar services to this, so maybe that helped this a little bit, but really most companies, especially the companies that we counted on as partners in the construction arena, were very receptive to it.
Fantastic. And Dan, as you just talk about, somebody who's looking for ways to improve the management of their supply chain, is there any advice that you would have to them, maybe on a broader scale, things they should be considering right now?
Well, I think you have to make a commitment, and it is going to take one or more people, it's within your company, working hand in hand with Browse when you do the initial implementation. And I was that person from the construction side. There were some other people from the human resources side. And so you've got to expect that it's going to take a little time, and you're going to feel some questions from contractors, even though Browse is here helping you. And so you got to make that commitment, and you've also got to make a commitment that this is the tool that we're going to use, and If you don't want to go this route, then sorry, we're not going to consider you for a bid list, because whenever you retreat from that and start letting someone still continue on a manual basis, then you've undermined the entire process and you've set it up to fail for you.
Okay, very helpful. Joel, what would you say the Browse was able to learn from the implementation of Southern Company with all the varied departments and stakeholders that were involved in the process? Are there any takeaways that you see from that implementation?
Yeah, I mean, one of the salient points that I took away from that, from my toolkit, Brett, was the communication plan, both internally and the lettering and the messaging to the contractors from an external communication perspective, to get the word out to the internal organization about the program, about the expectation of the instigator of the program, the support of the program. It's vital and key in the success of the program. Dan hit it right on the head in his earlier comments about having that support across the organization to make the program successful. And then the messaging out to the contractors about the expectation, again, to Dan's point, about this is our expectation as Southern Company of you as a contractor to Southern Company. This is what we need you to do in order to be able to do work for us. So the communication was the big point I took away from that, and I build on that over the last 8 years to ensure that we get good communication in hand to our clients and our potential clients at the jump of the program, so that's in play from the beginning, because that's a critical piece of this. That's what I took away from that implementation with Dan and the team at Southern Company.
That's great. Thanks, Joel. I mean, as you've talked about, I think Southern Company's just got a fantastic team that we've been able to work with over the years. Dan, I would ask you the question: what is the single biggest impact that Browse has had on your organization?
I think the fact that we can put a bid list together much quicker, and we know that we're consistently evaluating contractors. I think, for example, that there are other entities within our company that have kind of let us be the pilot for this, and they've seen what it's done for us, so now they're starting to do it. And so I just think really consistency, it's a time saver. So much that multiple people here were doing, Browse has taken over for us, and we know that that come January we're not going to have to go out and all our safety information is now dated, and Browse is going to go to those updates for us. We may still help them some if contractors are slow to respond, to emphasize, hey, you need to update your Browse data, but it's just streamlined and much easier for us to manage.
Okay, perfect. And that really segues into a question. As I mentioned, we've got a ton of questions here. We're going to do our best to get to all of them. We've only got about 10 minutes left. But the first one here asks a question about how has the supplier qualification timing changed since implementing Browse, or put differently, how long does it take to qualify suppliers using Browse, and how does that compare to the amount of time that you were spending before? And I think maybe a subset of that, how much data were you collecting before as opposed to what you're collecting today, and maybe how do those compare?
Well, and Joel probably will want to participate in this too. Browse is collecting more data, and they're doing more verification. So, we have a lot more information now than we had when we were doing it on a manual basis. As we were considering the Browse process, several of us were able to go out to Utah and watch the process, and it was kind of amazing to watch. And at that time, information came in by fax, by email, some of it mailed in, but the agents there would take that information and just sort through it, and they would go to various websites and verify information and then begin to enter that into the system. So, I mean, that was much more thorough than what we were doing. And a large part of how long it takes to get a company pre-qualified is really dependent on the contractor. I've seen it, done within 2 or 3 days if the contractor is really, straightforward and proactive to furnishing the information. If that's not the case, it could be weeks, I hate to say, but the information, if it's made available to browse, from what I can tell, is processed very quickly.
Yeah, and Dan, maybe I'll just elaborate on that. In my prior role, I was responsible for the teams that were qualifying and validating that information provided by the contractors, and our current turnaround time on any documentation provided is less than 24 hours. As you mentioned, I think the biggest challenge oftentimes is how much of the data being requested is readily available by that contractor organization. Another question here, Dan. Do you have a centralized or decentralized procurement organization, and how many company users do you currently have using Browse?
There is almost 1,000 companies that we're using for the generation construction side now in Browse. And I guess most of our procurement agents are kind of equally split between Birmingham and Atlanta. We also generally have at least one agent at each generating plant. So we are spread out quite a bit, and we do take, a couple of times a year to try to get together at a safety meeting or maybe just a supply chain conference to talk about issues and try to, promote consistency and so forth. So it's certainly not a case of all of us being in one area.
Okay, fantastic. And Joel, maybe just to clarify from your side, is there a limit to the number of user seats that an organization could have? So organization decides to join Browse as a client to manage their contractors. How many user seats are available to them?
Yeah, there really is no limit on the number of user seats available to an organization. I just ran a quick report for Southern Company. There's just over 600 users at Southern Company in the Browse database for Southern Company. So there's no limit on the number of seats. And the more people, obviously, the more people that we get in and do the training with to start utilizing this data, the more beneficial it becomes to the client organization as a whole.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Joel. Dan, just one more question for you. Is it a requirement that 100% of the contractors get pre-qualified through Browse? If so, how do you manage or audit this?
For the most part, the only exception, as I mentioned earlier, is some specialty contractor that we do not expect to be using very often, maybe a consultant of some type, something of that nature. We would not, we'd still do a manual process on that. But heavy construction contractors, engineering contractors that we are, know we're going to be using again and again and again, yes, Browse is a requirement, and we stick strongly to that. We just are completing a large facility over in Mississippi, and one of the objectives there was to use a lot of local contractors, and so I'm sure we had a lot of contractors that joined Browse and then probably bailed out later on because they didn't see any other opportunities. But we, continued with that objective and made that a requirement for that work. So
fantastic. Joel, a couple of questions for you, and again, we're getting short on time here, so we'll get to as many of these as we can. If we're not able to answer all of your questions, we'd be happy to follow up after this webinar and make sure those get answered by email. Joel, the question for you, regarding supplier assessments, does Browse use nationally and internationally recognized standards, for example, CSR, ISO 9000, 9001, diversity, EEOC, and other similar standards?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. I mean, when you talk about ISO certifications, there's ISO certifications specific to industries, and we hold an account for and validate different industries through the ISO certification process. CFR, yeah, we're looking at national and international standards by which to metric contractors based on industry, based on client requirements, based on the nature of the program in and of itself. So the answer to that is yes.
Okay, thanks, Joel. And there's another question here. The comment is, I'm really not sure what Browse does. Can you help me understand that? And so maybe we'll take just a minute to address that, because I do realize that there are individuals from varying backgrounds who may or may not be familiar with Browse, and I'll just briefly touch on that. Browse really works with large enterprise organizations who have suppliers and contractors that they are outsourcing work or making purchases from. Browse has a patented online system. It's all software as a service. We work with those client organizations to identify the risks that they have within their supply chain. We help them to develop assessments that their contractors and suppliers will complete before being awarded work. Browse takes all that information that's provided and uploaded by the supply chain through our platform. We have a team of service professionals here who will go through to score and validate that information. That information is all then made readily available to the client organization. So when someone like Dan at Southern Company logs in, they see at a glance who does or doesn't meet their standards. We also assign a single point of contact to every member of your supply chain, someone who is familiar with that contractor or supplier's business and your requirements. So we help to provide the fastest path to compliance. We also have a dedicated support team for you as the client organization to assist you throughout the process, helping you to understand where the risks within your supply chain might exist. And then we monitor all of the data provided by your supply chain throughout the year so that it's always current and up to date. Joel, with that background, there's a question here. It asks a little bit about maybe some of the hidden risks that may not be apparent to a supply chain. You know, some of the things that we talk about, you know, if there's an accident or, you know, hopefully never a fatality, one of the real impacts there potentially is to the brand of the organization that has hired that contractor or supplier. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the risks that organizations face when hiring third parties? We've only got about 2 minutes, so we'll need to move through that quickly.
Yeah, I know that in one of my client implementation experiences, they realized that they were operating probably 70% outside of a formal agreement or contract or paper with their contractors. Obviously, this was a grave concern to them, because if there's no PO, if there's no agreement in place, then liability kind of gets shifted from contractor to client, client to contractor. There's no real outline as to who's responsible for what. So we were able to link into the procurement tool and bring in contract information and load it into Browse and make that part of their compliance portfolio, because they recognized that they were at risk operating with so many of their contractors outside of formal agreements and papers. So that was one of the intangible benefits that they recognized by the utilization of Browse.
Great, thanks, Joel. And that actually brings us to the end of our presentation. I did want to make everyone aware of another upcoming webinar where we're actually going to be talking about how you can evaluate your supply chain down to the employee level of those contractors and suppliers that you hire. So not just evaluating the organization, but the individual. How can you ensure that if the contractor that you've hired hires a new employee, that they have the appropriate trainings in place? And so we'll be holding that on April 14th. You can register for that by going to www.browse.com/webinar. And with that, we want to thank everyone for joining us. For those questions that we were not able to get to, we will make sure to follow up after this presentation and provide answers. We want to make sure that all of your questions have been addressed. Elise, with that, I'll turn the time back over to you.
Excellent. Well, so just want to let our audience know that the presentation is going to be hosted on our website. We were recording today, and so we'll have the presentation as well as the on-demand viewing link. So once that's all set up on our website, I'm going to send that around in an email, so don't need to take anything down. Just keep a lookout for an email coming from Elise Santos. And so we also have a very, very short survey at the end of this webinar, and if you're still around, it's super simple, 2 questions, won't even take a minute of your time. We kind of just want to know how we did today. We want some feedback, share any comments or suggested topics you want to hear about in future webinars. And so with that, I want to thank the audience for attending, and for our wonderful panel of speakers today. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it. So from Browse and from ProcureCon, thanks again, guys, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Take care.